Welcome to the Explainer. When most of us think of a state, we probably just picture a static map with defined borders or maybe a massive government building. But actually, that's an illusion. A state is a living, breathing construct. It morphs, it adapts, and it fundamentally changes its character over time to deal with society, economics, and global pressures. So today, we're diving into the fascinating evolutionary arc of the Indian state over a 50-year period. We're going to see how it transformed from a newly independent welfare provider into what modern scholars call a virtual state. But before we trace that arc, we really need to figure out what we're actually looking at. The political theorist Ralph Miliband hit the nail on the head here. He pointed out that the state isn't just some abstract idea floating in the ether. No, it's found in an elaborate system of physical, actual institutions. The government, the military, the police, the judiciary. These are the tangible gears and levers that make up the state. And it's through these very specific institutions that the state actually exercises its legitimate coercive power. All right, here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, defining the state. Second, the foundational identity. Third, complexities and contradictions. Fourth, the 4 stages of evolution. And finally, number 5, the virtual state era. Let's jump right into Section 1, defining the state, and how political scientists actually study it. So you can't just read a country's rulebook to understand how it really works. It's like a giant puzzle, and to see the whole picture, you have to look through multiple lenses at the exact same time. Obviously, analyzing the Constitution is step 1, but you also have to observe societal power relations, like how do people and groups actually interact on the ground. Then there's the Marxian lens, which examines the mode of production to see who controls the economy. We also study the political executive to see which classes are actually represented in power. And finally, especially today, we have to assess external sovereignty to see how outside pressures might limit a state's true independence. Keeping those lenses in mind, let's move to Section 2 and look at the foundational identity, the original blueprint of the post-colonial Indian state. Following independence, the Constitution makers didn't just draft a few basic laws. They created a massively ambitious blueprint built on 5 core pillars. First, a liberal democratic structure, a sovereign republic where power rests with the people. Second, a federal state, balancing power between the center and the states. Third, it was liberal socialist, meaning the state would control the commanding heights of the economy. Fourth, a secular state with no official religion. And fifth, a welfare state built on positive intervention. This was essentially a high-wire act, trying to juggle rapid economic growth with socialist, equitable distribution. Now for Section 3, complexities and contradictions. Because, as we all know, theory is one thing, and the messy reality of governing is entirely another. Let's zoom in on that constitutional ideal of the welfare state. In political theory, a welfare state means the government actively agrees to underwrite the basics of human survival: employment, income, education, medical care, and housing. In India, this was heavily pushed through the massive 5-year plans. The state was really meant to be the great equalizer, directly intervening to lift up disadvantaged classes and wipe out mass poverty. So, what happened when they tried to implement that grand vision? Well, economist Gunnar Myrdal objectively analyzed this and coined a brilliant term, the soft state. It basically describes a state that has all these beautiful welfare goals written down on paper, but a profound inability to actually enforce its policies in the real world. The state had the blueprint, sure, but it completely lacked the rigid enforcement mechanisms needed to actually alleviate mass poverty. Now, if we look through that Marxist lens we mentioned earlier, a completely different critique emerges. Marxist scholars impartially argue that the state functionally remained semi-feudal and semi-colonial. The thought process here is pretty straightforward. The elites managing these modern institutions were products of colonialism, and pre-colonial authority patterns, like local landlords and rigid social hierarchies, stayed active on the ground. So the modern institutions didn't actually shift the real balance of power. This tension brings us to Section 4, the 4 stages of evolution, where we trace the state's actual historical arc. Over 50 years, the state went through 4 distinct, kind of whiplash-inducing stages. In the 1950s, we had the promising stage, lots of optimism and rhetoric about distributive justice. Then, jumping to the late 60s and early 70s, we hit the assertive stage, where the state aggressively pushed back with things like bank nationalization and land reforms. To manage growing conflicts, this shifted into the repressive stage from 1975 to 1977, centralizing power during the national emergency. And finally, by the 1990s, driven by globalization, we see the state retreat, the government pulling back to make room for market forces. Which leads us perfectly into Section 5, the virtual state era. This is the modern reality we live in today. The contrast between the old blueprint and the modern era is absolutely stark. We've moved from an interventionist state to a virtual state. The old interventionist state wanted to be the direct executor of welfare, building, managing, and providing everything itself. But the virtual state, it's basically a facilitator. It's market-friendly, focusing heavily on deregulation, privatization, and creating an optimal space for foreign direct investment. Instead of trying to control capital, the state now coordinates with it. To actually achieve this virtual state status, a massive internal paradigm shift had to happen. The government adopted an official rollback policy. And get this, suddenly, downsizing wasn't viewed as a failure anymore. It became the ultimate index of efficiency. The heavy bureaucratic machine of the welfare era was now seen as a total burden that needed serious fiscal discipline. And this transformation was practically executed through three very specific rollback measures. First, downsizing the employees, literally just reducing the number of people working for the state. Second, downsizing the territorial jurisdiction of services, meaning the state physically retreated from managing certain areas of public life. And third, downsizing budgetary allocations to service sectors. By pulling funds, the state officially accepted that social development was now heavily the responsibility of the private and corporate sectors. So, as we wrap up this explainer, we can clearly see just how incredibly dynamic the concept of the state really is. From a towering provider to a streamlined facilitator, the evolution is undeniable. But I want to leave you with this provocative thought. As the state officially retreats, handing its welfare services over to the free market and multinational corporations, who truly holds the ultimate power over the nation's destiny today? If the state is just coordinating, who's actually in charge? Thanks for joining me to explore this, and keep questioning the structures around you.